So thank you all for being here tonight, and welcome to the annual Seaman Lecture. This is actually an endowed lecture that our office, Student and Employee Accessibility Services here at Brown, has the privilege to put on each year. And it's actually a lecture meant to feature some aspect of diversity in learning. And so we are really excited this year that we're able to sort of focus really on disability as being part of the diversity conversations, and hope you really enjoy the event tonight. I'm going to introduce the speaker who's going to introduce the speaker. So let me start by saying that Lisa Carriaga-Lowe is our Vice President for Academic Development, Diversity, and Inclusion. Dr. Carriaga-Lowe is a faculty member also in the Education Department at Brown. And from 2007 to 2012, she was at Harvard as their Assistant Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity. Before that, she was Assistant Dean at the Yale Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and Director of the Office of Diversity and Equal Opportunity, as well as a faculty member at Yale Medical School. That makes her sound like she was extremely busy. She received her doctoral training in education and developmental psychology from Harvard University. So besides teaching courses related to developmental psychology, minority health, and health disparities, Dr. Carriaga-Lowe has also taught Asian American Studies and African American Studies courses and consults widely on cultural diversity and higher education issues. She was the recipient of the Chang Lin Tien Leadership and Education Award from the Asian Pacific Fund in 2014, and she is currently completing work on a book about identity development of Asian Americans. So it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Carriaga-Lowe.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you for attending this very special Seaman lecture. It is my great privilege first to be introduced by Kathy Axe, who has been a remarkable leader here at Brown and actually beyond Brown. So I first of all want to thank Kathy Axe for her work in ensuring that accessibility issues in higher education, but accessibility issues and disability rights continue to be central to the work that we do as higher education institutions. So thank you, Kathy. I am privileged to be able to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this year's Seaman Lecture. Judith Heumann is a remarkable leader who has been central to the work in supporting disability rights and accessibility concerns, not just in this country, but in the world. She served as the first special advisor for international disability rights at the U.S. Department of State from 2010 to 2017, serving under the Obama administration. She previously served as the director of the Department on Disability Services for the District of Columbia, where she was responsible for the Developmental Disability Administration and the Rehabilitation Services Administration. From June 2002 to 2006, Judith served as the World Bank's first advisor on disability and development. In this position, Judith led the World Bank's disability work to expand the bank's knowledge and capability to work with governments and civil society on including disability in the bank discussions with client countries. From 1993 to 2001, Judith served in the Clinton administration as the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services in the Department of Education and was responsible for the implementation of legislation at the national level for programs in special education, disability research, vocational rehabilitation, and independent living, serving more than 8 million youth and adults with disabilities. For more than 40 years, Judith has been involved on the international front working with disabled people's organizations and governments around the world to advance the human rights of disabled people. Judith graduated from Long Island University and received her master's in public health from the University of California at Berkeley. She has received numerous awards, including being the first recipient of the Henry B. Betts Award in recognition of efforts to significantly improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. She has received an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Long Island University in Brooklyn, an honorary doctorate of public administration from the University of Illinois Champaign, and as well an honorary doctorate of public service from the University of Toledo. Today I'm really pleased to have Judith in our midst in part because we here have been struggling for quite some time around how we fully integrate disability rights and accessibility issues into creating the kind of inclusive academic community that we aspire to here at Brown. And even as we have struggled with and tried to more intentionally address these issues as part of the university-wide diversity and inclusion action plan, I know and you know that we need to do more. And so I'm eager to learn from Judith's remarkable experience, but also on the lessons learned from both her work here in this country, but also beyond into other parts of the world. Her work matters so much in helping us understand how we can more fully develop the kinds of resources that are needed to really support all of our communities, and in the intersectional ways in which we should in fact be ensuring that disability rights are as essential to the life of this university. And so please join me in welcoming Judith Heumann to Brown.
Thank you very much. So, you know, when I come and give lectures like this, it's always an interesting experience. I speak to people on the phone who are from the place I'm going to speak to, and so Sarah and Eli, who are here, have been really helpful in giving me information about what's been going on here at Brown. And then today we had a great meeting with a number of you in the room who are students who have disabilities, and it's a learning opportunity for myself. And so really today what I want to do is have a conversation with you where I can be sharing information about my experiences, which I believe probably relate to many of your experiences. And ultimately, I think the issue that we're looking at is how do we make disability beyond accessibility, which in my view is a legal obligation of, in this case, universities, and has been since 1973. How do we move the discussion away from accommodations to really looking at the issue of what is the university's responsibility to ensure that you are learning what you need to be learning in order to be able to be a part of the future of the United States and of the international community. So I will go back a little bit in time. As you can tell, I've done many things in my life, not for 30 seconds, and so I'm 69 years old. And as Lisa said, I worked in the Obama administration, and the elections that occurred in November resulted in all of us who are political appointees leaving the administration. And it remains to be seen whether or not the current administration will in fact fill the position that the Obama administration had created, which, as you had said, is the first time there ever was a person working at the State Department as the Special Advisor for International Disability Rights. Now, I mentioned that position and the position that I had over at the World Bank for very particular reasons as it pertains to the work that Brown has been engaged in and is continuing to embark on. And that is, as a person who had responsibility for basically helping large institutions that work in bilateral and multilateral arenas and with nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations around the world, my message was, I need to make sure that disability becomes an integral part of the work that's going on within government and non-government. How many of you have ever heard of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? Good, so you'll know, and I'll share the information about it for those of you who don't know. But the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was the first treaty adopted by the United States in this century, focusing on anything. This was on disability. And the treaty itself is quite important because its very existence is the result of work that disabled people did around the world. And so when we look at the United States and we look at struggles that we continue to have, even with, I think, very powerful legislation that we have in place, we can only imagine what many developing countries and middle-income countries are trying to address, when one of the big issues in those countries is stigma, to a degree that we actually have no personal experience with in the United States. Not that we don't face stigma, but the degree of stigma that exists in some countries is so overwhelming that the data that we see shows 1 billion people with disabilities in the world, at least 15%, and that disabled people are the poorest of the poor, the least educated, the most unemployed in the formal sector. And here we're talking about people with physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, blindness, deafness, hard of hearing, low vision, and people with invisible disabilities, which we recognize and allied countries frequently are recognizing, depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, et cetera, but in many other countries are not even acknowledged as being a disability. And that's a very big problem because you look at countries like China. China is a country of more than 3 billion people. China officially acknowledges 85 million disabled people. We in the United States officially acknowledge somewhere between 54 and 56 million disabled people. So you can see that the lack of data that exists has a very big bearing on many things. Because if a country is not accurately looking at the number of people with disabilities, it can't appropriately do its budgeting. It can't appropriately be looking at issues around healthcare, the physical environment, employment, education, et cetera. So Brown, as a university, which I think appropriately prides itself in the role it's playing both domestically and internationally, in order to be a truly relevant institution, in my view, needs to be looking at the issue of disability and how it relates to the work that the institution is trying to do. And when I was at the bank and at the State Department, and even at the Department of Education, which is a domestic agency, the offices I oversaw obviously understood disability because that was what they were hired to do. But if you looked internally at other parts of the department, you could see that we hired the most disabled people in the Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitative Services and the Office of Civil Rights. We really, when trying to push the inclusion of disability in areas like primary and secondary education, higher education, had to do an incredible amount of work to get people to be able to understand the relevance, to understand what needed to happen to ensure that students with disabilities would be able to benefit from Section 504, that people would be able to apply to universities without bias and be accepted based on their qualifications, testing and accommodations that needed to be made, on and on. So I go back in time to when I was a kid. And I think it's relevant, and I talk about this a lot because I say that I'm old, and I am, but not that old in relationship to the history of the United States and the world. But I think it's important, when we speak to people in other countries, for example, to allow people to get a better understanding of what did the United States look like not too long ago. Because when you're looking at a country that is an emerging country from whatever the issues may be that they've been trying to address, it's important to see that a country like the United States in the 1950s and 60s still had basically no laws to protect the rights of disabled people. That when the civil rights laws went through in the 1960s, they did not include disabled individuals. That the '64 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and others did not include disability, and that in 1968, when there was an attempt made to amend the Civil Rights Act to integrate disability into it, there was, I think, a legitimate concern that opening the Civil Rights Act to amend it for inclusion of disabled people could have adversely affected the Civil Rights Act itself. But it basically meant that disabled individuals were not a part of that movement, even though disabled people come in all shapes, in all sizes. We come from every group, LGBT, gender, religious minorities, on and on and on. But we've been a pretty invisible group within most of those communities. And as a movement ourselves, we're still not where we need to be. So we're still struggling ourselves on whether we identify as having a disability, Many people have invisible disabilities, and I completely respect and understand the difficulty in coming out as someone with an invisible disability, given experiences that people may have had both at universities and in employment. But the reality of the situation is it's critically important for us as disabled individuals and as allies of people with disabilities that we be able to really continue to grow and formulate strong political movements. And I believe, universities are an amazing place. You're at a university 4, 6, 8, 10 years of your life, and it's a time for exploration. I mean, one of the reasons students come to Brown, I'm quite sure, is not only the diversity of the university, but the exploration that the university is encouraging. What we now call intersectionality of, a new word for me. Catherine works with me. Intersectionality is a new word. But so when my mother took me to school when I was 5, because I had polio in 1949 when I was 18 months old, there were no laws, as I said, and my parents had no expectations that they had any rights to be able to get anything from the school district, but they knew they had a duty to take their child to school. I was the oldest of 3. But they learned pretty early on that really nobody expected them to exercise that duty. And if they didn't exercise that, what they thought was a duty, nothing really would happen. And that when my mother took me to school, the principal said I couldn't go to that school because I couldn't walk and because the school wasn't accessible, even though my mother would have carried me up and down the stairs. But the principal said at that time, no worries, because the Board of Education would send a teacher to my house. So they did for 2.5 hours a week. So I didn't go to kindergarten at all. And let me please clarify in case there's any confusion. This was not just something happening to Judith Heumann in Brooklyn, New York. It wasn't me, the only person not going to school. So they sent a teacher to my house 2.5 hours a week. My brothers, who were younger than me, they were not going to school 2.5 hours a week. Now, they would have maybe liked to go to school sometimes 2.5 hours a week, but that was not what was happening. And there was no real outcry going on about why were disabled children not in school. We didn't have a law until 1973 and 1975 that required that disabled students at the federal level had to go to school. That's pretty amazing. And when you think about it, what has that resulted in? That's resulted in the fact that many individuals who could have gone to universities weren't able to go to universities. So let me explain my educational setting. So when I was 9 years old, my mother was given a call that they wanted her to bring me to Health Conservation 21 classes. I mean, you'll notice in disability, we have all this terminology, special education. So we know in the disability community, if anybody calls us special, run, because it doesn't mean anything positive. So can you imagine in 1954, any of you, or your brothers or sisters, having to go to a school and be screened before they would have to accept you? And they didn't have to accept you. They could reject you. So my mother had to come to school every day for 5 days with me, and I was evaluated, and then they had a committee meeting to decide whether or not I could go to that program. So let me explain the school. It was a regular school in Brooklyn, New York. The neighborhood was primarily white. The school was primarily white, but I was accepted into HC 21 classes in PS 219, and it was a racially integrated program. Everything in disability in that time period was in fact racially integrated. Our schools and our camps. We didn't go to the same camps. We did everything separately. So I grew up in an environment where it wasn't cross-disability, although there were people with various types of disabilities. Camps were more likely to be cross-disability. So that's when I first met a group of friends who were deaf, and that's when I started learning sign language. Although the speech therapist at the camp said I shouldn't learn sign language because it was going to prevent my deaf friends from learning how to speak. It made no sense to me, so we just moved on and agreed to disagree. But I say this because we were really in a separate world. We call the non-disabled children the kids upstairs, because the kids upstairs would come down and the good kids would be allowed to come and help us get our coats on and off. And on the days we went to assembly, they could come and push us to the assembly. We didn't eat lunch with the non-disabled kids, although the cafeteria was literally down the hall. We didn't even use the same bathrooms because they built bathrooms in the special ed classes. So it was a completely segregated environment. Now, also to mention that when I entered that program, there were no students who had ever graduated and gone to high school. Students stayed in that program till they were 21 years old, and then they went to sheltered workshops. How many of you ever heard of sheltered workshops? Okay, so sheltered workshops still exist today, although their numbers are really decreasing, but they're basically a place where disabled individuals were sent to quote-unquote work, and the work was typically menial. It was legal and still is legal to pay below minimum wage. If the Federal Department of Labor does a review and says you can't produce to the same level as a non-disabled person. Now, of course, one of the jokes in the disability community was, so they would take someone who had cerebral palsy and had physical disability, and they would give them a job which required physical ability, like stuffing envelopes or whatever. So, and those were some of the jobs that people were supposed to do. And of course, they couldn't do those jobs. So I was the first student from HC 21 at PS 219 to go to high school. That was after my mother and other mothers of students who used wheelchairs had gotten together to force the Board of Education to make schools in New York City accessible. So it's not that long ago that segregation was very prominent in the United States, was not looked at as segregation by the general community. And there was very little action going on, except the work that parents were trying to do. And you know, I think for me, that was a very important time in my life because I learned many things. I learned that there were students in the class who were not taught to read. And because I was really bored, I was working with some of these students to help them learn how to read, recognizing that they were able to learn how to read, but nobody had taught them how to learn how to read. And that's when I became interested in becoming a teacher. And that's when I also recognized that you have a disability, you use a wheelchair, you want to be a teacher. According to my friends in high school who had disabilities, don't tell anybody you want to be a teacher. Because there were no people in wheelchairs who were teachers at that time. And the Department of Rehabilitation, who was going to pay for my education, I was told, don't tell them you want to be a teacher because they won't pay for you to go to school. You have to pick a field where you can show that someone like yourself is working in a similar job. So I did that, and I minored in education. So at that time, minoring was 4 courses. No professor ever asked me why I was taking education classes. Nobody. I think back on it, it's like, why didn't anybody ask me why I was taking these education classes? Because at that time in New York, it was the end of the baby boom era, and so they were really looking to get teachers into the classroom, and they were allowing people to minor in education, have to get a master's within 5 years, and in order to be able to teach. But so my friends and I, we worked on different ways that I could learn how to be teaching. We set up an after-school program. I did tutoring and all kinds of things with other people. Now, when I went to the university, I think some of this will be different than today, but in some schools is still similar. There was no Disabled Student Services Office. This was in 1960s when I went to Long Island University in Brooklyn. It was a one-block school. There were steps into the dormitory. There was a step into the bathroom. There were not accessible bathrooms by and large. And accessibility was something that was not really paid attention to. And those of us who had disabilities began to come together. We were looking at other universities around the United States, like the University of Illinois, and others that were beginning to recruit students with disabilities, particularly veterans, and looking at what we could do to make our university accessible. And we were successful on getting a Disabled Student Services Office developed. Now, that was a very empowering experience, and I mention this because I think it's very important for us as disabled individuals and for allies to recognize that the ability to come together to identify a problem and to look at what we need to do to address that problem is very important. And in the area of disability, I think one of the big issues that existed then and still exists today to a somewhat lesser degree is that disabled people are looked at from a medical perspective, from a health perspective. Looking at disability as a human rights and civil rights issue is still something that people are struggling with, which makes me struggle because I don't get why it's such a difficult thing to see when you sit down and talk to people and you learn about issues that they've experienced. And can I have the water? To me, it's when you think about like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if you are learning anything about US laws like Section 504 or the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or when you're looking at issues like juvenile justice and prisons that have 60 to 70% kids with disabilities in those prisons, most of them with psychosocial disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and other invisible disabilities, many of whom for the first time are being identified as having disabilities when they're in prison, meaning the law was not appropriately used for them, and so they basically were failing and are beginning to get some services when they've already failed within the system. So not being able to look at disability as a civil rights issue and a human rights issue is something that I think, you all need to be grappling with, because so much of that is going on here at Brown. How is disability being integrated into the work that's going on at Brown University? And why is it not? I mean, I think for me, in many ways, the why is because the faculty and students, many of them have never seriously looked at disability as a civil and human rights issue. And I think that's something that is still significantly the case. And therefore, I think, it's really an issue of leadership. It's an issue of leadership from the students, from the faculty, and from the leadership of the universities themselves that really need to say, okay, there are 1 billion disabled people in the world, the poorest, the most uneducated, the most unemployed, on and on and on. What is it that we are not doing to prepare people who are going out into the world of work in the US and around the world? What are we not doing to advance this discussion? I think, Brown has been doing great work on diversity. It's seen as being a leader in this area. And so the ability to really embrace disability broadly beyond accessibility. As I said when we were meeting at lunch today, what if I had the power to wave a magic wand and remove all of the accessibility issues, not just physical, but sign language interpreters, services for blind individuals, for people with intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, on and on and on. Those were no longer issues here at Brown. So what would be the issues that you would want to be addressed? And it really, I think, is looking at what is going on in the area of people of color, what is going on in the LGBTQ area, what is going on in gender, what do we know about violence against disabled people, what do we know about disabled people, what do we know about non-disabled individuals who who experience violence and become disabled? What do we know about what's going on in Africa on issues like this? What's going on in the area of mental health, not just from a services perspective, but a human rights perspective? I mean, those are the issues that I think need to be grappled with. You know, basic data. Data is the biggest excuse. I love data. So when I went to work at the World Bank in 2003, the bank, economists, data. So they have a whole bureau on data. So with a very straight face, I went and I said, could you please supply me with the data that you have on disability? We had a very straight-faced discussion where they told me it would take them a month. They would get back to me in a month to let me know what they had. So what do you think they had? That's right.
0.
They had nothing. It did take them a month to let me know that they had nothing. Because I think they were, you know, they were embarrassed. You know, they recognized that this was a big issue. But then getting it into the agenda, into their agenda, was very difficult. I mean, they were, the World Bank and the World Health Organization were the two institutions that came out with the report in 2011 on the World Health Report on Disability, which elevated from 10% to 15% the number of disabled individuals, and they've been doing some very good work in that area. They recently, a year and a half ago, hired another person to focus on the issues of disability. So there is work going on there. But again, I think, you know, Brown University, Columbia University, and many other prestigious universities in the early 1900s were teaching courses on eugenics. And that was a part of the universities. So the teaching of eugenics was something that died after the Holocaust, when people realized that, no, this shouldn't be done this way. So it gets done in other ways. But I really think, you know, we need to look at how our institutions of educational leadership, what role do they need to play? And what role can you, as faculty and students, really encourage the leadership of the university to address in order to ensure that Brown, in its efforts to be a more diverse, inclusive institution, really is more diverse and inclusive and includes disabled people. So thank you. Okay, so why don't we open this up to discussion? What is that?
This is a special kind of microphone. Hold it still and you can talk into it.
Come on, guys. Yep. If you could give me your name.
Hello, my name is Hector.
Oops. Sorry, could you say that again?
My name is Hector.
Hector, sorry.
Hector. Yes. You mentioned that if we could remove all of the accessibility issues and we are left with everything else, could you repeat the part how you connected that to LGBT and people of color?
Okay, so if you have a disability and you're a person of color, the question is the university addressing the issues of a person of color with a disability? So you come to the university, let's say you're deaf or you have a learning disability, you have a physical disability, those might be the primary issues that are being addressed. But if those were not issues any longer, what would you, as a person of color who has a disability, want the university to be doing? To be addressing academic issues of relevance. So, you know, for me, I would say, when you look at the issue I was mentioning earlier of juvenile justice or juvenile justice facilities, there's an overpopulation of students who are African American and Latinos. And in many cases, although the law provides all kinds of protections for children and rights for parents, frequently parents don't know their rights, they don't know what to do, and therefore, if English is not the first language, or if people are working multiple jobs and can't participate in learning experiences, their children may be dropping out of school, may be getting involved in activities that are not appropriate. What is the university doing to really help ensure that people get a much clearer understanding of who the population of disabled individuals are in the African American community, in the Asian community, in the Latino community, whatever? What are some of the unique issues? What kind of survey work is going on to speak to families and disabled individuals about, I mean, any one of a whole host of areas? Acceptance in the community, stigma in the community, ability to receive services. I mean, I could sit down and think of a litany of things that need to be done. But it is important. I mean, in the Latino community, which also has a large immigrant population, many people coming from other countries where rights and the ability to speak up for their rights is something that they weren't able to do, and getting people to be able to understand what rights are, complicated now by everything going on with this administration, but even before this happened, looking at a calmer period of time, frequently, even knowing about what your rights are, parents need to be able to be working with parents who they can get support from. So they know how to go to a meeting, what's called an IEP meeting, if they have a child with a disability. If they believe there's a problem and they want their child to get assessed, that they have some basic information about what to do. Frequently, you know, parents whose first language isn't English, whatever their first language may be, even though there are parent programs in the United States to help people learn, they're still not getting what they need. So you can see the consequences of that. When you look at issues like salary, if you look at disabled individuals, if you look at white non-disabled individuals, and you compare white disabled individuals to white non-disabled individuals, white disabled individuals earn less money than white non-disabled individuals. If you look at African Americans with disabilities, they're earning less than white disabled individuals, and Latinos, on and on and on. So the numbers get worse, and yet the ability to collect that data, there's more data being collected now, but there's much more need for it to be collected. And I mean, in English literature, in Latino literature, in African American literature, whatever the subject may be, talking to disabled individuals, allowing people to feel like disability isn't something to be ashamed of. I always get emotional, sorry. But, you know, I think that's really a fundamental problem, that shame is so much a part of disability. Even if you haven't grown up in an environment where your family around you is stating it. It's things that happen. It's how many of us feel very invisible. And, you know, when you come to a university, in my view, you know, when I was, as I was saying earlier, in the 60s, when we were looking at setting up a disability services office, you know, we were still talking about, we need to get this done because we need to get disability integrated into the curricula. You know, we need to get disability seen as an integral part of work that's going on. Because universities have been changing for decades, right? They've been looking at issues of diversity. This just didn't start happening. I think as there's been a more educated, diverse population of students and faculty, they've been putting more demands on universities to do a better job, and they've understood more about what the weaknesses are within the universities. So that's really, it's not that white people started deciding, oh, we need to deal with these issues more. It happened for lots of different reasons, and that's what's still really needed. I mean, the head of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker. So I've spoken to him a number of times in the last year. The Ford Foundation last summer came out basically with a letter from him saying, how could we have ignored disability? And I've told him this. Actually, the Ford Foundation did not ignore disability. The Ford Foundation made a conscious decision not to include disabled people. Conscious. In 1981, there was an organization started called the Disability Rights, Education, and Defense Fund. It was the first national legal defense fund for disabled individuals, and it was supported by all the major, NAACP and all the organizations that had legal defense funds. They were all getting and still get money from the Ford Foundation. So DREDF was just starting, and they applied for money. They got a $50,000 check with a letter that said, do not apply again. So I'm very supportive of the work that Darren is doing to really look at this issue of disability and from an issue of power and privilege, et cetera. But it's no different than Brown and all these other very well-respected institutions really kind of it's not that they don't know, it's that the knowledge and I think fear. I mean, stories about Ford are kind of hysterical, actually. When I was an assistant secretary at the Department of Education, and the secretary, that's the person in charge of the Federal Department of Education, a big position, he was going to New York, and I was going to be in New York at the same time. So we worked on organizing a meeting where the head of the Department of Education in New York City and the secretary and myself would be there, and we were inviting in parents and individuals, students with disabilities, to talk about issues around education. So not me, but somebody on the secretary's staff said, oh, the Ford Foundation is right in that area. So why don't we just ask them if we can meet there? So they did. It was amazing. They couldn't say no. You can't say no to the secretary of the Department of Education and to the head of the Department of Education of the city of New York. But they said they would not serve any food. It was 12 o'clock. Nobody was asking them to, but it was the Ford Foundation. And they wanted nobody to know that there should be no expectations that the holding of this meeting at the Ford Foundation in any way was an indication that Ford was looking to beginning to fund disability. So, Darren wasn't there, he knows nothing about this, but I did tell him that. So, there are conscious decisions, and I think they're made out of fear, and they're made out of fear because people don't know, what does it mean for these things to be happening? And I think it's the same thing, in a university. If you don't, and I know that Brown has a number of people here who've been looking, Sarah and others, who've been looking at issues around disability and inclusion. So I think, that's very important. And there is much more work that's been being done over the last number of decades. But the final acceptance and legitimacy of disability as a part of the work that's going on here and in other institutions, asking questions like you were just asking with the people who you think are the ones who should be involved in those discussions, I think is really the environment that you're trying to create. Here and then here.
Hi, Bibi again. Thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering, in all of your speaking and touring and working, what concrete action or thing you have seen that has really inspired you recently, that has gone beyond, say, accessibility services and into really integrating disability into curricula and whatnot?
I think, there are many universities that are doing work in this area. Berkeley now has a minor in disability, so they have between, I think, 10 and 15 courses on disability that are being taught at any one time a year. They're a much bigger institution, obviously, than Brown, but they've also, through a foundation grant, hired a chair on disability who is, and we were talking about this a few minutes ago, an amazing woman, and I think it would be great to be able to bring her here to Brown to really help you look at some of the issues from an academic perspective. I mean, her background, Karen Nakamura, she's done work on disability studies, on LGBTQ, on issues in Japan. She's an anthropologist. I mean, it'd be great maybe that someone could send around her resume, but I would say that's a very important accomplishment because the Haas Foundation funded 3 chairs. The fact that they funded a chair on disability is a very important acknowledgement that as a foundation, they saw this as something critical. And also, I think the university there has been doing a lot of work for many years with different departments. University of Illinois, Harvard, and some of their departments. I mean, really, I think that's a very important question that you're asking. And one of the things I think to look at is who are the institutions of higher education that Brown works with? And I know that Kathy has attended some meetings. I think it would be really very relevant to know how other universities that you're working with are being inclusive of disability. What are the questions and the problems that they're dealing with in trying to advance this issue, and what have they done and how have they made progress? I think that's very important. I think Japan is doing some very interesting work, the Canadians, the Brits, the Irish, the Germans. There's more work that's being done looking at the issue of disability as an integral part of human rights, civil rights, science, gender, et cetera. So I think there's a lot out there. There are quite a number of new books that are being published. I think being able to learn about the books that are coming out and sharing them, looking at ways that this discussion can become an ongoing discussion, not just with disabled students, but really looking at the issue of accommodations as we need to do this. This is our legal obligation. What else do we need to do, and how do we do it? And how does Brown integrate that? I mean, in one of the reports that I was looking at on diversity, it said that disability was a blind spot in the work that was going on in Brown. That in and of itself really made me laugh, disability as a blind spot. But so it's an acknowledgement that this is something that hasn't been done, but it was really looking at it again more from the accessibility perspective than from the academic perspective. There's a question over here. The gentleman with the hat. Oh, I should remember. Chris?
Hi,
No.
my name is Charlie, and I was wondering, you mentioned the importance of viewing disability through a social lens rather than a medical one. And I'm wondering if you're aware of any medical school in the United States that is considered a leader in this context.
I'm not, but I'm sure we could figure out. Are you interested in medical school? Or?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. I
Well,
mean, it would present
actually-
an obvious issue.
Actually, I do know. There's a Eli, you want to raise your hand? So, do you know Eli? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Eli Wolf here at Brown, the Royce Fellowship, and I've been part of the disability community. I was a graduate of Brown and have been here for many years.
But at this point, for this question, his wife is a doctor and she has a disability. She went to Stanford, Harvard. She's highly respected. She's paraplegic. She's highly respected in her field, does all kinds of amazing work, both in Boston and internationally. And she would be the type of person also, you know, that could really help you link into what was going on in various medical schools around the country and how they are looking at, and this is a big issue, you know, because
It's not just happening. Sherry actually just gave, at Harvard, she just gave the very first disability as diversity talk just earlier this year, ever in the history of Harvard.
Yeah, so it's a new
topic.
Could you hear what he said? Yeah. So, I mean, I think stepping forward as Brown with this $1 billion initiative that you've got going on with $25 million that's going to be used to bring in populations of people who have been previously underrepresented in graduate programs, and $20 million for undergraduate programs. How is disability being integrated into that? Disability gender, disability race, disability whatever. You know, how is that happening? And it is not going to happen unless it's consciously done, unless people respect the fact that this is an issue that hasn't been looked at and that serious attention needs to be paid in order to address it. And equally importantly, what the positive outcome will be at the end. Because I think that's what we're talking about. It strengthens, diversity is something that more and more business community, universities, governments, et cetera, are recognizing that diversity enriches our community. Even though there are people in the country right now who basically are, in my view, very disrespectful of diversity and don't understand the importance of diversity, we understand the importance of diversity. And universities in being able, and I'm not just singling out university, but that's where we are today, in the next 5 to 10 years, if this issue is really embraced, there will be amazing work that will come out of this that will positively impact not just the community in Rhode Island or the United States, but Brown is a university that it's a university of influence. When Brown does something like this, really broadly looking at diversity, it does influence others. And it does make people say, well, let's look at this differently, because an institution like Brown and Berkeley and University of Illinois and Harvard and whoever are like, we've moved away from eugenics as our main theme, and we've looked at the issue of inclusion of disability as a rights-based issue, as a scientific issue, as an education issue, as a social policy issue, whatever it is that you're studying. There's really nothing where disability doesn't play a role. I think, you know, just surveying the students here about what their experiences have been. Harvard just came out with the book that Kathy's got, what the heck's the name of it, do you remember? It's okay, it's basically, it's a book that was written on students at Harvard and with various types of disabilities and their experiences. And it was led by a guy who's the former director of special education at the Department of Education with me. It's a great book. How Did We Get Here is the name of the book. So I just think, you know, Brown needs to embrace disability as an integral part of its diversity work, and then really reach out and look at disability in the breadth of diversity that you're working on, because it will really have a major impact in so many fields.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Someone else had a hand up. The
Hi.
woman in black.
Um,
Oh, sorry. No, sorry.
Hi, I'm Rachel. So I think it's a really interesting and a really important question that you asked students, which was like, what else is necessary moving forward besides accommodations? And I think that perhaps people who are not very familiar or have a lot of experience with disabilities or know people closely that identify with having disabilities kind of view accommodations as the only thing that's necessary and don't realize that accommodating disability isn't enough, and that you need to find ways to celebrate diversity instead of just accommodating it and include disability in that definition. Is there any particular like vocabulary or ways of explaining that you've found to be really effective to people who are not perhaps don't have much experience with disabilities or with people who identify with having disabilities.
I mean, to me, the vocabulary is sitting down and breaking bread together. It's requiring that people talk to each other. I can't, were you at lunch today? No. Were you at, Rachel, were you at
No.
lunch? Yeah. So that's okay. I'm just, but I thought the discussion at lunch was great because, you know, the students who were there were really talking about themselves, their experiences, not just their experiences at Brown, but their experiences prior to coming to Brown, experiences at Brown. And, you know, one of the women that was talking is in a graduate program in science. And her, you know, one of the questions that she asked is, now that she's at a different level because she's made it through undergraduate school, she's in graduate school, she's clearly got a lot further to go, but she feels more, I think, more respected and respected for the work that she's doing in the field of science. What more could she be doing? And so, you know, when you think about STEM, is STEM an issue that Brown is addressing? Science, yeah. So let's look at STEM. And let's look at disability in STEM. And let's look at the fact that disabled individuals with visible and invisible disabilities have been strongly discouraged from looking at majoring in various fields in STEM-related studies. Go back and look at disabled individuals being able to study in science in elementary school and high school. These are all major issues. Talk to students here about what their experiences have been. And if you're in part going out and trying to, I don't know if Brown has any programs where they're working with elementary schools as an example, but apparently you do. So you have a program that's dealing with STEM with elementary schools. So question would be, when you go to these elementary schools, do you ask the principal, are there students with disabilities in the classes that we're going to be talking to? You don't have to tell me who they are. I'm not asking you to do that. But then the people who are presenting need to be able to possibly bring some of your students who are now at university and graduate school levels who are studying in these fields, who can talk about why this is important, how you can do it, what universities do to accommodate, what businesses are doing to accommodate. But it's a very critical issue because people from all groups of disabled people have been, you know, discouraged. And when you look at some of the major litigation that first came out in Section 504, you know, one of the first cases was, I think in 1979, I'm forgetting the woman, but it was a deaf woman who was requesting sign language interpreter services. And the court ruled against her. But there was recently a case against Hopkins University. And it was, I think it was also a deaf individual in the field of science. And they were asking for accommodations. And Hopkins had said it was an undue hardship. And the court totally obliterated them and totally said, you cannot use this as a cost issue. You need to look at your budget in totality. Hopkins University budget in totality. Give me a break. Of course they'd have to provide her with those services. But I mean, that's why I'm saying, you know, the laws have progressed. There are better decisions that are coming out. People need to know about those decisions. And students who have disabilities and faculty with disabilities and faculty without disabilities who, you know, understand the importance of the inclusion of disabled students, they also need to be a part of what's going on. In recruitment, as an example. You know, I found that when I worked at the Department of Education, I had about 400 staff under me. And I basically told my staff, never present me with a list of people for any position that wasn't a diverse list. By that I meant diversity in race and disability. And if you don't give me that, forget it. I'm not going to approve anybody. And it was difficult because frequently people would go to the typical disability organizations to look for people. And what we found was, you were looking for a PhD or a postdoc in whatever field, you needed to go to the professional associations. You needed to go to their universities. You needed to look at who are the universities that you recruit from most frequently. Are you telling those universities, we are looking for disabled graduates? We want to meet those students. Because that also begins to change people's mindset when people are saying, people who have disabilities, people who are knowledgeable about disabilities in these areas, we want those individuals. That should be a positive. I mean, I think the other issue is that many people who have disabilities have had to deal with incredible adversity. And adversity really can make people much stronger, much better problem solvers, much better people able to work in teams, address problems, not get freaked out like other people may, because it's kind of a general experience for many of us. Things happen and we have to deal with it because we're not, more and more people are making a decision that we are not going backwards, we're going forwards. And so, I mean, I don't see any drawback. I really only see a richness. And I think that's really ultimately what I keep saying, whether I'm talking to the business community or to universities or, a lot of the work that I did in the 6.5 years that I was at the Department of State was not only looking at educating the staff at the department. For example, the Department of State is legally required every year to write a report on human rights. You may have read recently about the latest report that was put forward in a different way than in the past. And in that report, there is a section called Section 6, and in Section 6, disability is a part of the report. So when we first came in, there were a couple of us that joined at the same time. We were looking over the reports, and they were kind of a joke on the disability end, because most people, they were writing things like, there is no discrimination against disabled people in X country. All the students with disabilities are sent out of the country to go to school. Well, A, you know that all the students were not sent out of the country to go to school. And B, how could you say there was no discrimination if you're saying that students aren't being educated? So we spent a lot of time helping people to look at, talk to disability groups in the country that you live in. Don't just talk to the government. Listen to what the disability groups are telling you about what's happening. Engage with government so that they know that you're learning and you're asking. State does policy work. It's not a USAID. But nonetheless, there are very important roles that the State Department plays. And anybody can go look at these reports. They're publicly available. And I think if you look at many of the reports over the last 6 years in the area of disability, would we say that they're A levels? Some of them are, and many of them aren't. But there is definitely an improvement because it's been a drum roll that's been going on. The ability to review what people are writing, the ability to engage with people to help them look at what they can be doing to address this issue more thoroughly. So it's like keep turning things over and looking, putting on what we say is a disability lens. So putting a disability lens on everything that you're doing really allows you to begin to have a discussion. Everybody's not going to agree with each other about what needs to happen. Priorities will be set up, but nonetheless the discussion has to occur. If the discussion doesn't occur, if people don't listen to what people are saying, then advancement really can't happen. Yep.
Hi, my name is Crystal. So during lunch, we started to have a conversation as a group about how people identify, whether it be as a disabled person or a person with disability or as differently abled. And it got me thinking about maybe that rhetoric kind of impacting negatively us coming together as a collective. And so my question is, especially for people with invisible disabilities who might meet disability criteria for accommodations but don't go out of their way or outwardly identify as having a disability and because they don't have a visible disability, are often not considered as having a disability. What kind of advice or encouragement do you have for them to embrace that identity to help facilitate a more collective action? Especially because, as you said, the outing process can be intimidating or stigmatizing.
Thank you. I mean, I think there are many approaches that can be used, and at the end of the day, it needs to be approaches that you, whoa, sorry. At least it wasn't hot. Hold on a second. Thank you. Here. That's okay. Oh. 1 second. I have to let the pool fall. Anybody with a hairdryer? Hold on. Maybe I should take it off. I'm going to take this off. First of all, I don't think that people necessarily have to feel a necessity to be public about their disability if for some reason they don't feel like they want to be at this particular time in their life, but that people should understand what their rights are. So if you believe you need accommodations for something, it doesn't mean that you have to be able to come out with a flag that says I have X disability and I have to be acknowledged in order to get services. So I think these are all personal decisions, and I think people need to see a value. What is the value for me and for our group if I come out as someone who has a disability. So I think empowerment is very important. And for me, I know it's strange because I'm in a wheelchair, and as I've said before, I know I have a visible disability, but people can try to hide whether you have a visible or invisible disability. And for me, being public about it, talking about it, letting people know how discrimination how it impacts me, but equally important for me has been the ability to work with other people who agree that this form of discrimination adversely affects our lives, and we're not going to accept that. So the ability to come together, I talk about it as the ability to come together to go apart. Coming together where I can speak to people who have different types of disabilities, to me is important because as an advocate, it's important for me to understand issues for people who have different types of disabilities, so that I'm not just talking about my personal disability, so that I understand issues like CART and captioning and alternative media and extended test time and whatever it may be that an individual is trying to address. I need to have enough knowledge and comfort to be able to speak about it because it's part of our movement. So I think that's another issue for me, is that when we look at 56 million disabled people, we're the most diverse groups in many ways, because most of us are not born with our disabilities, or even if we are born with our disability, it may not be noticed until one becomes older. And then because of the intergenerational issue around disability, many people who acquire disabilities are doing so as they're getting older. And again, the whole medical model. I mean, I've done a lot of talking on aging and disability because, one day I woke up and I thought, this was like in the 70s, that the model for me, as I was saying earlier, is you have a disability at that time, you went into a segregated educational system, a segregated employment system, lots of segregation. And so as people are becoming older, what's happening to many people? They're going into segregated living environments, they have segregated day programs, people themselves are extracting themselves from their communities because they don't want to be a burden on their families. So they're going off to communities that are just for older people. And there, when you start talking about disability as a rights-based movement and we should have a right to be able to live in our communities, and issues like personal assistance services or whatever it may be, and accessibility of your home, it's this huge area. But ultimately, at the very beginning of your question, I think it's what does an individual person want? What do they need? What is maybe limiting someone or making someone ask questions about not only what do I want to call myself, but do I want to call myself anything? Do I want to identify? Is there a value for me to identify? And what is that value? And what can I contribute? So for me, the discussion at lunch was great for a lot of reasons, but it was very informative to me. It was informative to me to listen to people's different views and to have a discussion which was informative for me and I hope informative for the whole group. And at the end of the day, really make students feel like it is important to come together. It is important for us to go beyond me. It is important for me to go beyond me. That movements are not individuals. Movements are people coming together to express diverse views, but to be able to really feel like coming together will make a difference. And I think for those of us who are involved in one way or the other, frequently coming to various groups is an empowering experience. It's also a place where we can unload, where when terrible things may be happening, it's a space where you can feel comfortable talking to some people who will really get what you have to say because they may very well have a similar experience. And I think that, for me, as we discussed at lunch, am I a Martian? I had a friend in California where when things would be completely weird around disability, I would call her up and I would say, am I a Martian? And that was our joke, but led to great discussions. I don't know, did I answer your question? Yeah? Anybody else? Eli.
Hi, Judy. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Really amazing to have you here on campus. I wanted to just be able to sort of follow up on this conversation about movements and movement building. As we've seen, there's been such movement around the LGBT community, around race relations, gender, and disability seems to kind of be catching up. Maybe we've been lapped by these other areas. But I guess if you could speak a little bit to the organizing movement of students with disabilities, faculty, what do we need to do around this work at higher ed from a disability community perspective? Is there some kind of structure, tactics, things like that maybe you could suggest or kind of allude to?
So I'll give you some of my thoughts. I don't work at an institution of higher education, so, but I think when you look at issues like LGBT or race, people of color, I'm doing this little, I started something called the Human Perspective, and it's doing Facebook Lives and putting things forward on Facebook and tweeting and various other things. But when I was at State and LGBTQ issues were becoming more predominant, I was speaking to people and saying, okay, where are people from the LGBTQ community who have disabilities? And how are they being included? And certainly disabled people are from the LGBT communities, and in some cases quite out, but are not necessarily being invited to participate. So it gets back to this theme that I've been saying today. Look at what's going on at the university and put a disability lens on. And you know, whether you're from the LGBT community or the people of color community or whatever, coming out as a disabled person is something that may be a totally new experience, because maybe they haven't identified before. And the question would be, why is it relevant? I would say it's got relevance for many, many different reasons. But you know, when I look at countries like Uganda and Kenya and others, where they have such terrible policies around the LGBTQ issue, and where disability is such a huge stigma itself, you know, what is happening to disabled people in countries overseas where there would be a double stigma? What kind of additional oppression and discrimination are people facing, and what needs to be done at universities and other institutions of higher education, research, etc.? What needs to be done to legitimize this issue? You know, and in order to legitimize it, there needs to be discussion. You know, what are people from the LGBT community who have disabilities, what are their experiences? You know, certainly disabled individuals in the trans community. And there are more disabled individuals now who were out as disabled people who are in the trans community. And what opportunities are they, you know, being given to be a part of these broader discussions? So I think it's, you know, it's not creating something exclusively separate on disability. It's having diversity in the disability discussions that then allow people to go to their different corner or corners, you know, because if you're a Latina, disabled lesbian, where do you go? You may want to go to all three groups. You may want to look at a way that you bring discussions together so you can look at the totality of an issue. And that's not just a disability issue. You know, you can think of any one of the many other groups where discrimination is occurring, where the addition of disability could be a real problem for the individual or for the family. But I think the discussions need to happen. And I think it needs to be led by alumni, by students, by faculty. And ultimately, you know, Jim Wolfenson, when he was the president of the World Bank, he totally embraced this issue. And we had great access to him and his staff. And we were invited to senior leadership meetings. And all of the vice presidents were told that they needed to look at the issue of disability. And he put money into being able to do work in the different regional offices. And you know, the fact that he invited us to come and speak and talk about our work, and you know, both at state and at the bank, we set up something called points of contact. So that was, you know, very important, that there were people identified, you know, at the embassy level, at the whatever, at state, who had responsibility for disability. Now, that might mean they had responsibility for writing Section 6 on disability in the Human Rights Report, and that might be all it was. But for some, it would be much broader. If they personally were interested, if the ambassador had an interest in the issue, which many of them did. I mean, there's some, okay, we're almost finished. I'm going to tell you a funny story. So this was at the World Bank. And we were, Jim had given us like $1 million. And every region had to apply for money. And they were going to get money to be able to hire a consultant to do a review of what was going on in their region in disability. And so we were going around and talking to all the regional vice presidents. And the woman who was with the Asia region said that she wasn't so sure, but she was having a meeting with all her country directors. At the meeting that she had, where she raised the issue of inclusion of disability, unbeknownst to her, 2 of her directors of Pakistan and Bangladesh had children with disabilities. And in point of fact, we're doing work in the area of disability, but never gave the World Bank any credit because the bank hadn't said it was an issue that was of importance. So by blessing it, it enabled them to be more inclusive of disability. And in countries like Pakistan, they were doing some really good work on inclusive education as a result of the bank saying, no, this is an important issue, we want you to look at it. So I think, it's being willing to say, like, Ford said, what is the comment that Darren made? Basically, he said, in the letter that he wrote, he said, how had this happened? How could we possibly miss this? Meaning disability. The answer, simply put, is power, privilege, and ignorance, each of which multiplies the prejudicial effects of the other. The good news is we can change, and we are changing. Among all the many challenges facing our world and our work, the solution to this one is entirely within our control. And I think that's very true. So people make a decision to acknowledge, not in a way that has to make anybody feel badly, but okay, this is the truth and the reality. So what do we need to do to move forward and be public about our moving forward and really follow what Ford in a certain way is doing to really focus this issue in a public way. Anything else? So thank you.